Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 5. Make sure you like and follow wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and a reminder, we do this twice a week on Tuesdays and Fridays, talking football and gambling. We're fresh off of week 2 of the NFL season, and after a 10-6 week, I'm sitting at 21-11 on the year, and I'll take that picks-wise for this, which is a brand new project we've been doing for DRF Sports. If you're not familiar with the letters DRF, well, daily racing form has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. Now we're taking over the sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game and also the NBA, MLB, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all the details and insights. The site has all the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, head-to-head records, and team stats. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. If you want to see the trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. And if you want access to all the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you'll get the usual previews. Plus, we go into the games in depth on this podcast. However you want the betting information, we've got you covered. And on today's pod, we'll recap the football weekend in both the NFL and NCAA, plus hit you with some picks for the midweek football action. So I put in another call to my guy, Matt Russell, and luckily for us, he joins me right now. The man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Matt Russell is back on the DRF Sports Podcast. Mr. Russell, how you doing on this wonderful Tuesday morning?
Yeah, I'm exhausted again, and it's not because the Monday Nighter was a wild affair, though it was pretty intense for those betting on the point spread. I'm still wiped out from Sunday, man. Like, what a grind that was, at least for us. Now, maybe it was because week 1, it was just full of adrenaline because we basically won everything. This past Sunday was a little bit more how it kind of normally is, right? Where you're just grinding out the best you can do. And I'm sitting there and listen, those 1:00 games weren't the most thrilling things ever, but I'm sitting there and I had 4 quarterbacks go out, all teams that I had bet on to, one degree or another, nothing huge necessarily, but it's like, I grabbed a unit on Houston plus 14 and I had the Colts plus 3.5, which we talked about last week. And, if you throw in Miami and Chicago and we actually did okay. 3 of those 4 teams actually covered despite having to go to their backup quarterback. But when you see the backup quarterback come on, when you see TJ Watt go down, that was a loser, unfortunately. And you're sitting there going kind of the most important players on these teams. I'm going to need these guys. When I made these bets, I assumed 60 minutes of health from these guys, which of course you can never necessarily do in the NFL, but it would be nice to see one of my opponents, right? One of the big teams I had bet against lose a quarterback. So when you're getting into that circumstance, you're just trying to grab whatever you can get. And so, yeah, I was wiped out by the time Sunday night rolled around. I'm getting too old for this stuff. I'm certainly still wiped out here as we chat here on Tuesday morning.
You're right about grinding it out on Sunday. I thought I was having a pretty good week. And as always, that is thanks to you and the help that you provide us on the Friday pod each and every week. A great Sunday. And then the Sunday Nighter and Monday Nighter happened. And I end up finishing 10-6 on the week. And I'll take that. I'll take it. There were some crazy, wild finishes, OT games, kickers being involved in the mix. And anytime that's happening with the game on the line,
yeah.
you know where that can go, right? But the wild results, you mentioned the QBs going down, but
yeah.
What about how are you adjusting your ratings with some of these QBs going down? Because as you mentioned, 4 teams dealing with it now. And I think we've heard so far that we're not really sure about Andy Dalton's status. We know that Tyrod Taylor is out for Houston and they play on Thursday, which we'll get to later on. But overall, how is this affecting your ratings?
Yeah, I mean, it's case by case, like anything else, right? You have to kind of go through it and go, okay, like, what do I know about the guy who's going to replace said quarterback, right? Mm-hmm. And also, you had Carson Wentz go out, but that was at the end of the game. Jacob Eason comes in and he's got to make a bunch of throws, kind of coming in cold with a couple minutes left to go. Like he's now tasked to win the game for the Colts, right? Not really a fair position. At the same token, like, didn't look all that great, right? And so, I don't think we know what to make of Jacob Eason necessarily with a full week of practice. You look at Miami, right, with Jacoby Brissett, and they get shut out by Buffalo. But Jacoby Brissett has been in this position before, right? Like, he has played extensively in the NFL. And so I don't know that I'm looking to drop Miami, for example, all that much in my ratings because, again, it was ugly and there might be some value created by this, right? So it's ugly for Miami. They don't score any points. And so you go, okay, well, like, they're toast. But like, if he gets a full week of first team reps because Tua definitely can't go, then I'll be more apt to maybe back Miami, thinking, that most people are going to think that this is going to be a horror show against Las Vegas, where it's like Jacoby Brissett is a capable backup, right? Yeah. And so, whereas you've got Andy Dalton going down, and like, what if Justin Fields comes in? Now, he played a fair amount in that game. And like, the best thing that he did was recover his own fumble at one point. It was one of the great, fumble recoveries of all time. But like, everything else, I mean, he got a couple of first downs with his legs, certainly at the end there, but like, it didn't look so good, right? And he's their future, and I understand why people want him to play, but there's also just a real possibility. As much as we don't really, love Matt Nagy as a coach, it's a possibility he's aware that Justin Fields just isn't ready yet, right? And so I'm going to downgrade the Bears a lot in that situation, whereas I might not downgrade Miami that much because they're replacing a still relatively green Tua Tagovailoa with Jacoby Brissett, who has been around the block and for one game or two games can get it done in the NFL.
Yeah. And another key part of all this, of course, as we discuss a bunch of the injuries, remember to stay locked to drf.com/sports because they have all of the key injuries and all the latest updates and information that you'll need, because obviously these injuries will affect the betting angles. So you want to keep up with everything that's going on there. Remember, drf.com/sports has you covered. And, I look back and I think about what happened on Sunday. And as you mentioned, the QBs played such a huge role in things. But on the flip side, QBs that didn't get hurt and kind of put on a show on Sunday night, as I look towards Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes, you tried to warn me and the world on our Friday pod about jumping on the Chiefs bandwagon on Friday. And I told you that I knew I wasn't going to listen. I knew you were probably right, but I could see myself just jumping on the wave on Sunday night. And yeah, it kind of played out how you predicted, no?
Well, it's funny because you mentioned your 10-6 record, right? And so I was thinking to myself, is that 10-6 because he changed his pick over to the Baltimore Ravens or because he didn't? And it sounds like he didn't. But listen, you were 11-5 last week, right? And we talked about like the thin line, like a couple of changes here and there. And that's how you go from 8-8 to 10-6 or to 11-5, right? And so how did it play out? Did it play out exactly as I thought? Yes and no, right? Like, no, they throw Lamar throws the pick six like right off the bat, and you're going like, it's funny. I had this weird sensation. I was like, well, people are going to be really surprised when Baltimore covers this game based on the fact of how this game started. But because I knew that Baltimore was going to be able to run the football against Kansas City. Now, this is the NFL in 2021. In a lot of cases, you can run the football against a team. And it's like, they're kind of okay with it, right? They're like, go for your little 4 or 5 yards of carry here. Somebody's going to commit a hold at some point, and it's going to be 2nd and 20 or 2nd and 15. And then what are you going to do, right? Yeah. But like, Baltimore is different, right? Like, Baltimore has they have the good plays, right? Everybody says, why don't you just run the good plays? They kind of didn't run the good plays against Vegas. And I love that matchup because again, we talked about this last week, but it reminds me of when you and I talked about that game last year when Kansas City didn't look very good against the Chargers. And then they came in and they smoked Baltimore in Baltimore. And we were like, they didn't run any of these like trick funky plays against the Chargers, right? They had been saving them for Baltimore. So I think Baltimore got burned a little bit against Las Vegas because they didn't run the same running plays that they did against Kansas City, right? Like these trap plays that have Lamar in the middle, right? Like they played it very vanilla against Vegas and it cost them. They ended up losing that game. And so, you know, they busted out the good plays, right? The back end of the playbook, like the quality run plays, and they gashed Kansas City. Now, can you ever predict like 250 some odd rushing yards? No, not necessarily, but like what was working, right? And defensively, they were patient. They didn't send the blitz all the time against Patrick Mahomes and just have him burn them deep. He still managed to burn them deep a couple of times, but you know what? They locked down Tyreek Hill, right? Which is defensive game plan, right? Kansas City obviously wants to get the ball to Tyreek Hill, but he had like 3 targets the entire game. And so they locked down him. They forced somebody else to beat them. It looked like somebody else was going to beat them as Mahomes threw it to like 9 different guys. But if it, you know, fundamentally there, it's just a market thing, right? We're talking plus 3.5 in a game that, you know, my numbers made Kansas City a 0.5 point favorite. We saw the same matchup last year as Baltimore, a 3 to 3.5 point favorite. So that massive swing, it just leaves, as we talk about all the time, it just leaves, you know, this sort of like win probability section, right? Where it's like Kansas City could win this game by 1, 2, or 3 points, and you still end up a winner with Baltimore. But no, everybody just piles in on Kansas City, and they've now covered 2 of their last 14 games against the spread. Like you could say that about like the Jags or something like that, and we'd be like, this is the worst team we've ever seen. Like, how could you ever bet on the Jags? We do that. Like we might be headed there already because they go and can't even cover an outrageous number against Denver. And it's like, we look at those teams and are like, they're terrible because obviously the point spread is, could you please just cover 10, you know, getting 10 points. In this case, Kansas City is costing you just as much money out there, right? They are costing you more money, and we're fine with it because they end up most of the time pulling off a victory, right? And you and I always talk about like the point spread and the money line, and like, it's all a reflection of how likely, you know, Kansas City, Tampa Bay, whomever is to win the game. But when you talk about the point spread, you know, like it has to be off of that money line, right? It has to, you know, work in correlation of that money line. But these teams don't necessarily care about winning by 8 points, about winning by 10 points, or winning by 4 points, right? They just want to win the game. And Andy Reid and Kansas City have been winning 3-point games here for a really long time, and nobody seems to notice that they just never cover because people are already looking to back Kansas City this week against the Chargers. And you just have to sit and say to people like, maybe they cover, but they've lost you so much money that it's kind of not going to matter, right? Like the money's already gone, and you're going to have to do something pretty crazy here to work your way back if you've just been backing the Chiefs blindly for, you know, the last 14 games.
As I'm reading this tweet here from M. Russ Authentic, it says,
Sounds
why do
handsome.
Sportsbook always win? The Kansas City Chiefs fall to 2-11-1 against the spread in their last 14. And then says, yet you're already dying to bet them next week. The Chiefs tax is real. That was the information given out here on the pod, and it's super real. You mentioned something about not caring about what the point spread is, and this is something we've talked about in terms of you see the Chiefs get up by a certain number, and I'm not saying they take their foot off the gas, but as you mentioned, they're not bringing out their like A++ plays at a certain point of the game when they're up, and they're cruising at a certain point in that game, right? And they kind of, you know, shift gears a little, and then the Lamar train starts rolling, the momentum starts building back up. And then what do you know? Now you're trying to cover 3.5 points, and they were still in a position to win the game, if not for the fumble. But as you said, that's still not covering 3.5 points, right?
And the thing is, like, they have a fundamental flaw, right? Like we saw it in their run game. Now, listen, not every team can just show up and have the same effect that the Ravens do, right? Yeah. But the Ravens are, you know, built in a lot of ways to do that against Kansas City. If the Chargers, for instance, this week, right? Like if they all of a sudden ran for 250 yards on Kansas City, we'd be like, what? Like, I can't even necessarily picture that, right? Because Justin Herbert can run a little bit, but like, obviously they don't have the same playbook, right? They don't have the same skill in those positions.
Personnel.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a fundamental flaw there where if you can do one thing against a team, you can do that thing over and over and over again and hang in a game. Whereas you look at a team like Tampa Bay and it's like, What's their fundamental flaw? Well, like maybe it's their offensive, run game. Well, guess what? In 2021, that doesn't really matter, especially when you have Tom Brady, right? So it's like, it's not their defense, right? Because you can't run on Tampa Bay, right? The best you can do is try to play like a throw it, all over the field type of shootout with Tampa Bay and just kind of hope that the ball bounces your way. Maybe you get some turnovers. Maybe they don't turn you over, right? And we saw in the first game against Dallas had all the turnovers, right? And they hang in with Tampa Bay. We see it against Atlanta, right? Atlanta's hanging in there. It's a 3-point game, right? Much to our chagrin that, as backers of the Falcons, they go and just start throwing the ball around and balls get tipped and like the ball doesn't bounce their way in the fourth quarter, and 2 of those get returned for a touchdown. But the point is like, if we're looking at those 2 teams, sort of the quote unquote best teams of their conference, one team you can rely on to get a stop late in a game, and Kansas City, you can't. So, whether it's like foot off the gas or, whatever sort of cliche, if you will, like it's true offensively because they will, with 5 minutes to go, hand the ball off, right, to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And yes, he fumbles, right? Otherwise, Kansas City probably wins that game, right? There's a pretty high probability anyway. Yeah. And so, like, Tampa Bay will shut you down, whereas Kansas City was going to always kind of give up the last score if there was time on the clock for Baltimore. Right. In the same way that it's the reason why Baltimore went for it. Right. Because they're like, well, I don't want to give the ball to Patrick Mahomes. And it's like, that's not even like a controversial decision. Right. It's only the people who like me who like miss the days of like the 90s NFL football where it's like, oh my God, you would never go for it on 4th down. It's like, well, welcome to 2021 here. Right. Yeah. And so like, Baltimore can have the confidence to do that because they're not afraid of getting stopped. Whereas against a team like Tampa Bay, how many times, 4th down did Matt Ryan try to go for it? Like they're trying sneaks, like they can't even pull off a quarterback sneak against them. Right. So, there's a difference there. Right. And there's one team can hold, and that's what you need when you're laying a big number or you're, something over a touchdown. You need a team that defensively can stop the other team, right? They'll put up their points, but defensively at the end, do they have the will and a ability to stop that team? Whereas Kansas City, like they might have the will, but they just don't really have the ability. So you're always going to be in that backdoor range. In this case, it was backdoor and then lose the game, which doesn't necessarily happen that often to Kansas City, but it's something you got to keep in mind.
Yeah, you're totally right about that. It was weird to see them lose a game down the stretch and not cover, obviously, right? It's kind of weird, but still one of many crazy finishes on Sunday. Great finishes right down to the wire. I mean, I was able to hit on the Cowboys and the Titans. I know you were big on the Titans as well. That was one of the great picks you handed out on Friday. But I got to bring up the Vikings.
Oh, boy.
That missed field goal stung for a lot of reasons. And it's just like, the spread, cool. We're there. We're in the mix. Everything's cool. All right. But we had a little bit more riding on that. No?
Yeah. Last week we talked about the money line parlay, right? The round robin hit all 5 legs. We were Scrooge McDucking into the gold doubloon silos. Time of our lives, right? Yeah. Then we take out our towel. We dry ourselves off. I don't know why the doubloons are wet, whatever. And we get back to it, right? And we're like, okay, there's gonna be 5 games here. How do we find 5 underdogs, in a week that might not have them, right? There's no guarantee there's even gonna be 5 underdogs that win outright each week, right? Yeah. So we go and we find Carolina. That was a super easy one. Unfortunately, massive swing and a miss, in part because of the Tua injury in Miami. But, we got the Colts as well. And then that one was really close, but it doesn't work out. And so we're just then hoping to try to get our 3 out of our 5, right? To salvage
hold on. Can I stop you there for a second?
Sure.
The Colts didn't work out, but like Carson Wentz was doing his best Carson Wentz impression to make sure that didn't happen, right?
Listen, anytime you can get inside the 5-yard line twice in the first half and come away with 0 points because you get intercepted on a shovel pass, which like nobody gets that. Nobody gets intercepted on a 2-yard pass. Like, what? Like the point of the shovel pass is like it's impossible to get intercepted on, and like he was somehow inaccurate from 2 yards away. And so then he gets, they still take the lead right later on in the game. And like, then of course, Carson Wentz gets injured because it's a Sunday, and that's the kind of just thing that's going to happen. And so yes, you're right. Like they cover the spread.
My bad.
No,
I just
you're
had to
totally
bring
right
that
because,
up.
like, it's funny because we use the sort of binary, right? Like 1-0, like you either win or you lose. And, there's a bunch of bets. Like I would use Atlanta as one of those examples where, from a metric standpoint, from a yardage standpoint, that should have been a 5-point Tampa victory, right? Based on yardage, yards per play, all of that sort of thing, right? So, why wasn't it? Well, because, 2 balls ended up in Tampa Bay Buccaneers' hands late, and they were celebrating in the end zone about 4 seconds later, right? And that's how that game ends up being a 3-touchdown game instead of a 5-point game or even a 12-point game, both of which would have been helpful to us, right? So, whether it's the Colts and that whole situation there with the, 2 being inside the 5, first and goal, and not being able to get it done, or the Falcons, right? You have these bets where you go, you know what? Really good bet, man. Just lost, so obviously Colts, we won from the point spread standpoint, but money line didn't work out. So point is, we've got 1 leg out of the 5. We still have 2 games left to go for the afternoon slate. And of course, Tennessee goes down a little bit, but we knew, right? Like that was going to be last team to have the ball wins. Sure enough, that's exactly how it worked out. And Tennessee ends up getting the win, but we didn't know that at the time of your man's Greg Joseph just lining stuff up there for the Vikings. And he's striping kicks against the Bengals, 50 plus yarders. And like Vikings fans that I know are like, we've got a kicker. Like the ghost of Blair Walsh is dead. Like, no, we're all set. Like, even though they lost, right? Because they kind of got jammed up on that Dalvin Cook fumble that wasn't really a fumble. And so, then, the game against Arizona rolls around and they're in control. Well, you can never say they're in control because both teams full on track meet situation. But listen, that's a chip shot, man. Like 37 yards. Like the announcer, hopefully, everybody out there heard the clip, but the announcer's it's good. No, it's not good. And I'm like, even though you get used to it with just, college kickers on Saturday and then kickers, even in the NFL on Sunday, like it still just cuts to the core of you. Right? Yeah. When a kicker, just a chip shot too. And then you go and you flip over and like Dallas is, he's making 50 yarders and it's like, there's no rhyme or reason. We were watching guys miss or, short kicks early and hit long kicks later on. And you're just like, I don't understand. Right. And it's just all psychology, right? It's all mental, but you're just like, this guy isn't damaged yet. He doesn't have all of that, weight on his shoulders. It's just like, just make the 37 yarder. And so turns out, right, Vikings, if that had gotten there, would have connected the Carolina leg and the Titans leg, which is up over plus 200. So we would have had back-to-back weeks where at least the round robin money line parlay is profitable. So all the round robin money line parlay people out there are just, up in arms. If we were all maniacs, we'd be invoicing Greg Joseph right now, but we're not. And, we're still playing with more than enough house money on the general, process of the round robin money line parlay. But like, make a kick, man, make a kick. What a game that was. I mean, it was a fantastic and wild game. And, that's going to be every Cardinals game, I'm pretty sure, this year.
In the wise words of Bill Belichick, do your job.
Yeah. Yeah, you have like, one job.
Just one. Make a kick, bro. But if we continue the theme of just talking about betting and handicapping thoughts, and we talked a lot about the overreaction last week, right? Of how some of these lines swung all the way to being over 3.5 points, which wasn't the case the week prior. So heading into week 3, what's kind of the thing that we're looking at here, especially in regards to the 0-2 teams?
Yeah, and that's it, right? It's betting on the uncomfortable, right? And it's betting against the Chiefs. I don't mean that necessarily specifically this week, but listen, recent history would suggest that's probably a decent idea. But it's talking about week 2. Like, look at all those games, right? All of those games that were plus 3.5s that probably should have been under a touchdown. Carolina gets there, Indy gets there, Minnesota gets there, Baltimore gets there, right? They're all the same type of a game where it's just the team that you don't want anything to do with. And that's why the market pushes it up over 3. Now, week 3, right? Like, if we had a gold doubloon, for every time we say the words, hey, let's remember this for next year, right? So like, that's hey, let's remember this for next year for week 2. For week 3, what do we remember from last year? Or what do we remember from a trend standpoint? I'm not a huge trends guy necessarily, but like, if it has reason to it, I'm all for it. 0-2 teams are like over 60% against the spread, right? And it's for obvious reasons. throw all the narrative in there, right? Like the desperation, like blah, blah, blah. Think about how hard all these guys work. And you can talk about it for week 2 or week 3, but like how hard they work all year round, right? Just to make an NFL football team, then to be ready for the start of the season. And then you lose in that first game. And then you lose in that second game. And maybe it's because the kicker, right? He goes and he misses a 37-yarder. And you're sitting there going like, we've done everything we could to win, especially if you're the Vikings. Like, let's just use them as an example.
Yeah.
They're 0-2. They're 0-2 because the referees made a bad call on a fumble for Dalvin Cook in overtime. Now, listen, they shouldn't have been in overtime in the first place. You could make the case. I completely understand all of that. And then their, kicker misses a 37-yarder. So if you're Dalvin Cook or offensive lineman X or defensive back Y, you're sitting there going like, we're way better than this. And the season's not over. But of course, the week goes along and you hear people talk about, well, if you start 0-3, there's like a 92% chance you're going to miss the playoffs. So like, you better not start 0-3. And so, I look and I go, okay, well, you know what? The Vikings also haven't been at home yet. Yeah. Right. So you're getting that extra bounce. And so like the quote unquote desperation element of being down 0-2, coming home, like all of that stuff lends itself to being underrated, undervalued in the marketplace, but also that there's going to be sort of an undefinable, unsort of mathematically quantifiable element to rating that team for this week, right? Like, so I would expect the Vikings to perform at a really, really high rate relative to what they're capable of, right? Now, they're not going to be perfect because they're not capable of being perfect, but they're capable of playing really good football. So I would expect that from them. And so whether it's that situation or a situation of, like the Jacksonville Jaguars or some other, really bad team, we know we're bad, and they're 0-2, and it's like, okay, they're still probably going to go 0-3, but the market is going to treat them like hot garbage, right? Like they are going to bump that number up. Like we see Detroit loses last night, so now they're 0-2. And the last we see of Jared Goff is he's fumbling snaps and he's throwing interception. And the guy just melts in any kind of weather. And so that all happens, but like they were still up at halftime, right? Like they were still leading that game at halftime. And so what happens is the Ravens go from like 7-point favorites, and now they reopen at 9.5-point favorites. And I imagine people are still going to come in on Baltimore. And so that number probably ends up going to 10. And then you just sit and you go, okay, like we're not talking about wins and losses here like we are with the Vikings. We're just talking about an over or undervaluation depending on, who we're talking about specifically. But when it comes to Detroit, for example, there's going to be an undervaluation there. And like they're going to be facing a different team than Green Bay, right? Like Lamar Jackson's not going to be dropping dimes like Aaron Rodgers was, zipping it by linebackers' ear holes and finding Devontae Adams deep. Like that's not what Lamar Jackson does. Now, is Detroit capable of stopping the run? Maybe not here, right? But we're talking about like a different bar here. So if this thing gets to 10, which I think it might, I think that's where value starts to creep in on grabbing an 0-2 team. So you have to be a little bit discernible because it's not 100%. Like we said, it's 2%, I believe it is, for 0-2 teams. And so, it's situational dependent, but like you have to be open to the idea that just because a team lost in their first 2 games and maybe they didn't cover in those first 2 games, it's far too early in the season to just throw a team on the like do not bet list and sort of just walk away.
Unless we're talking about the Jets, but
for sure.
But you're talking about, looking for value, seeking certain prices. And I think that kind of fits into, a bit of a bad beat, let's say, because the Bengals and Bears game, right? That game ends up landing on 3, but I want to ask you about the importance of price, because we talk about it a little bit on the Friday pod. For people who might not understand, how is that game a really good example of the importance of price?
Well, it's funny, right? Because these lines get put up on Sunday night, right? Or Monday, depending on sort of when, if you've played on Monday night or whatever. And this one was interesting to me because Chicago is opened as 3-point favorites, right? And everybody, shouldn't say everybody, right? But money comes in on Cincinnati at +3. And so if you're somebody who's just, sort of tailing a market, right? And what that means is, you're watching a line move and you're going, listen, sharp money by and large is going to move a line. Now, you don't have to just follow that blindly for 2 reasons. One, the quote unquote sharp money is going to win 58% of the time, like in a really good season. So there's 42 out of 100 games where that line move is just going to be flat out wrong, and you're going to find some value going the other way. But what's the difference is between that sharp money and between Joe Blow is if Joe Blow, who's even like relatively sharp when it comes to market chasing and like watching the market moves, and they know, right? And they're watching lines on Sunday or Monday morning and they see 3. And they don't necessarily do anything about it because they don't have a big take on Chicago, Cincinnati, right?
Yeah.
And then they see that number come off of 3, and you immediately should think, rightfully, oh, sharp money's on Cincinnati at +3. They grabbed that +3. They thought that to be valuable. But what the important thing here is don't just grab +2.5 because the quote unquote sharp money knows something, right? Like now Cincinnati is going to win this game as the underdog because they became a very public underdog play because people are like, oh, Bears stink. Like, think about it, right? Bears lose, Bengals win in week 1. So now people believe that the Bengals are going to beat the Bears. And so the bad beat element of all of this comes in where like the Bears are, that game's stretched out. They're up 17 points in the 4th quarter. So even if you got a bad number on the Bears, like you're still feeling pretty good. But all of that sharp money got bailed out with the way that game ended, where it lands on 3, right? The 2 touchdowns late for Cincinnati. And so those guys, the pros, if you will, are sitting there going like, no harm, no foul, got the best price. But if you were chasing at +2.5, or you were using the information that people like the Bengals who have influence, and you took the money line, for example, right? Because you thought they were onto something and thus you were going to be onto something as well. Your ledger is, there's a loss on your ledger, right? Your record goes from 10-6, if you will, to 9-7. Whereas theirs just goes from 10-6, to 9-6-1. They don't lose any money on it, right? And so I'm all for and do a ton of the sort of like market, following or whatever, right? To sort of understand where the money is going. But if you don't capture that key number of 3, you can get yourself in trouble, right? And at the end of the year, you can be like, I did everything that they did. And it's like, well, you have 5 more losses than they do, quote unquote, right? And it's because you got in late, because that's just how this game works.
Totally. And that's why we try to give you more information on a week-to-week basis here, just to inform you as the betting public, to try to give you a bit of an edge. But of course, that's just part of what we do here on the podcast. And if you want more of that information so you can get more insight on the lines, head to drf.com/sports for all the details and insights. And because the site has all the data on every single game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, head-to-head records, and team stats. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. And if you want access to all the raw data, again, drf.com/sports, where there's the usual previews. Plus we go into the games in depth on this podcast. Basically, however you want your betting information, we've got you covered. And the thing is, we got you covered on the NFL, and we're going to switch gears a little here and go to college football, which was also a very big weekend. And we'll start with the big boys of Alabama. They got a bit of a test, but I have a question here. What's up with your boy, Dan Mullen? He's been a topic of discussion on this pod for a while, but what happened there this weekend?
Yeah, he got us. He got us, right? Like, we were all excited. We're like, AR-15's coming in, right? Anthony Richardson. We were a little worried about the hamstring, and then all week, right? Dan Mullen's like, yeah, no, he's practicing, like, looks okay. And like, I think there was a second MRI in the mix there somewhere. You never want the second MRI. Like, that's never a good thing. So again, write that down for next time. So, we're like, okay, let's grab some Heisman, Anthony Richardson. You could see, it was funny because Florida's hanging around, right? And they're hanging around just enough to not to have to break glass in case of emergency and grab Richardson, tear the headset off of him and throw him in there, because they're hanging in there and they end up covering. They end up doing so relatively comfortably. And we're a 2-point conversion away from having that game tied. Now, listen, you and I both know Alabama's probably going down and scoring to win that game after that 2-point conversion if they needed to, right? But of course they didn't. All they needed was a first down. So, a little bit bummed out that we didn't get to see our guy, Anthony Richardson. So he still sits at 100-1. And, you know, the more time goes by, right, the less chance there is for him to come in and show out. And listen, it's 100-1 bet. So it's not like, you know, we had massive investments in it. It was the thing that we were just hoping to see, right? I wanted to see that guy against Alabama. And now the problem is, now normally I would say to you, like, good news is, we're going to be able to bet him next year for the Heisman Trophy. But the problem is we're probably going to see just enough of him this season, especially potentially in a bowl game, that like people are going to catch on. And once the market reopens for the 2022 season, he's probably going to be down to like 5-1, right? And so we didn't miss out necessarily, but like Dan Mullen sort of tricked us into thinking that we might get to see AR-15 on Saturday, and we just didn't. But it worked out for Florida and certainly for the cover. So, you know, there's only so mad we could be necessarily, but it was just kind of disappointing given how excited we were last week to see Richardson.
Sticking with this college football theme and what happened this weekend, what happened in the Pac-12? Because a tough go for the undefeateds. What went wrong there?
Yeah, right. We're like, okay, Ohio State loses, Oregon beats them. Like, look out, Pac-12. Like, we've been talking a lot of bleep about them, and now they're like ready to party. And we've like circled the calendar. We're like October 2nd, Arizona State and UCLA. Like, that's coming right around the corner. That's going to be a battle of undefeateds here potentially. Now, we did mention both those teams had tricky games. We talked about the BYU game, and listen, again, box score. You look at that box score and you go, how did Arizona State not win this game? Right? Like, I don't know if they would have covered necessarily or whatever, but like they got absolutely no bounces. They took way too many penalties. They basically Los Angeles Chargered their way into a loss, right? Against BYU, college version, right? Not that far away from San Diego is Tempe, Arizona. And so they both lose, right? Fresno comes out and bites UCLA. And I want to say I had a feeling or whatever, but I was sort of fighting the urge to grab the money line. But the point is like, that's why we said, let's take a wait and see approach, right? Let's wait for that game on October 2nd to, first of all, make sure both teams are undefeated, and then sort of pick our side either before or after that game, because you have to allow for teams, especially in college football, to screw it up. And that's what both of them did, right? And so now you're sitting there at the end of September, and everybody but Oregon is out of the mix when it comes to the Pac-12. And I'm here to tell you, Oregon's probably going to lose a game or two, you know, in that Pac-12 schedule, because as much as Utah looks not very good, or certainly not as good as we thought, and Arizona State and UCLA lost, both those teams are capable of beating Oregon at some point. And so this might just be the case of same old Pac-12, which sucks to say, especially after last week where we're like, it's not the same old Pac-12, but it literally took them like 2 days for them to basically, you know, revert back to where they were. So kind of a bummer there, but it opens things up even further. Now, maybe it ends up opening things up for Clemson to get back in the mix, or Ohio State to get back in the mix. But what is it open for? We talked about Cincinnati getting that win against Indiana. And listen, it looked dicey for a very long time, but they got it done. And so next up is Notre Dame in a couple of weeks. And, you know, that's the game to circle for Cincinnati's hopes to at least get into that top four from a, you know, a ranking standpoint. Once you're in that top four, right, you got to drag them out of there one way or another. So that's the team that's left, sort of sitting there while the Pac-12 melts away and the ACC appears to be melting away here, because Clemson just barely got by Georgia Tech this weekend. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. So Cincinnati, right? Like, we're sitting there, and listen, Desmond Ridder didn't look all that great, but again, if he gets to the end here 12-0 and he puts up the numbers that he's going to put up once we get to conference play, we're looking at it. And that was 66-1. Then it was 28-1, and we were still like pretty sure I would make that bet still. And now he's sitting at like 12-1, even lower than that in some places, right? So we're seeing him move along here. So Notre Dame for him on deck here, and you know, that's going to be circle the calendar. We're going to be talking about that one next week.
The Heisman watch, right? The Heisman watch we enjoy a lot. What about Bryce Young? Is he still the favorite?
Yeah, I mean, he and Matt Corral now, right, are sort of jostling for the favorite. And it's funny because like Matt Corral hasn't played anybody from a, you know, defensive standpoint. And listen, he might put up a ton of points. They actually meet up in, I believe 2 weeks, right, essentially. And so, you know, is Alabama going to shut down Matt Corral? But like, more importantly for Bryce Young, I'll ask you, like, against a Florida team, like, yeah, they put up points, but it's a lot of just throw it to a teammate and have that guy just making moves. And in the first half of that game, when Alabama built that lead, there was a lot of, even the announcers mentioned it. They're like, and we're talking about Florida here. It's like Florida's athletes just can't find the angle on Alabama's athletes. And we're talking about Gators, right? Like the Gators not having good enough athletes to make tackles in the open field. And so it's like, so if Bryce Young, all he's going to do is just throw 10-yard passes to the fleet of dudes that he's got on that team, and they're just going to out-angle everybody because they're that much better than them. I just don't see how voters at the end of the day are going to be like, yup, he led the way, especially if there are other stories and other explosive players. And Corral is certainly one of those, but we'll see if Alabama, wait for it, can corral in a couple of weeks. And then that opens up the door for a couple of other guys like our guy Desmond Ridder, or even maybe Sam Howell, who had like roughly 1 billion touchdowns this past weekend, even after looking pretty bad against Virginia Tech a few weeks ago. So a lot still going on in the Heisman race here, and the favorites still very vulnerable. So it's an interesting market to maybe get something down on here.
You mentioned the favorites, but what about some other futures as you look, especially towards the ACC and Clemson? Yep. You mentioned they struggled, but is there an opportunity here when you look at the futures of the ACC in particular?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways here, and we'll talk about the Big Ten as well. So remind me to do that. But whether it's Ohio State sort of struggling against Tulsa or Clemson struggling, they've got 2 wins, right? A barely win against Georgia Tech, and then South Carolina State the week before. And so to me, I just watch this team and I go, like, this isn't the Clemson team that we've had over the last 5 seasons. And it's not just DJ. We're not going to beat him up here because he's not as good as Trevor Lawrence. And it's like, yeah, okay. Like, that's not the worst thing to say about a human being. Like, I guess who else isn't as good as Trevor Lawrence? Me. Yeah. And I don't take that personally. And he's not as good as Deshaun Watson, right? And it's like, if you've lived the Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence life for basically 5 out of the last 6 years, right? There's some Kelly Bryant in there, but we saw maybe DJ just happens to be more Kelly Bryant than he is Trevor Lawrence, at which point Clemson becomes a lot more vulnerable. But if Clemson is going to be priced like Clemson in the ACC, then there's a chance one of 2 things happens. There's a chance somebody knocks them off on the way to the ACC championship, which then means that somebody in the other division becomes really valuable, because right now we're just assuming, okay, whoever plays Clemson in the championship game is going to be 3 touchdown underdogs. And so it's hard to recommend a bet on any team in the other division, right? Because you're like, well, we're just going to get there and lose to Clemson. So what's going on over in the other division is Virginia Tech. And now we were on West Virginia this week. That got a little bit dicey at the end. I almost wasn't even paying attention as Virginia Tech pulls off a crazy comeback, or almost pulls off, I should say, a crazy comeback. But this is a team that already has a win under their belt against North Carolina, right? So for them to not make the ACC title game, they're going to have to lose 2 games, right? Because North Carolina is going to, they don't have the tiebreaker against North Carolina. So North Carolina would have to flat out beat them. And right now they're like plus 300 to win the division in the ACC. And so I really like that bet as a concept. Over in Clemson's division, like, they play NC State this week at NC State. I like NC State, and I'm going to be on the money line there. And we'll talk about that more on Friday, but they're 10-point underdogs. And I don't know necessarily that I'm, even comfortable at all thinking that Clemson is definitively going to win by double digits against a functional team in the ACC. So that early game with Virginia Tech beating North Carolina really jams up North Carolina, because they would have a really good chance to beat Clemson, even if it got to that point. And of course, we're thinking that maybe it might not even get to that point. But the problem is they're behind Virginia Tech in this way. And Virginia Tech's schedule is a little bit softer. And people might be off of Virginia Tech because of the losses here. Mm-hmm. But those were not, conference losses. Those don't count on the standings, right? They just sort of count to public perception. And so I'm fine with backing Virginia Tech in the long term here in the ACC, because they have this head start that people aren't necessarily giving enough credit to. Now, I want to talk about the Big Ten. I reminded myself, pretty sharp guy.
Oh yeah.
So same sort of deal, right? Ohio State, we all just assume Ohio State, they're going to be 3 touchdown favorites in the conference championship game. And we watch them play, and they're getting gashed by Oregon, and they're getting gashed by Tulsa, right? And I'm like, okay, but like there's a possibility Ohio State isn't that good. And they're sitting there and they've got Penn State in their division. And like, yes, like Penn State has to come to them, but going to the I was going to call it the Big House. Oh my God, the people would be just up in arms. the horseshoe, yeah. Again, Ohio State has to play Michigan also later on, but I don't know that that's necessarily going to be a game because it never is. But the point is like going to the horseshoe isn't all that scary because listen, Oregon just did it. And Tulsa did it. And like they managed to survive. Now Tulsa lost, but like they certainly covered that game really, really easily. So like Penn State could win that game. And so what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to look at the Big Ten West, and Wisconsin already has a conference loss to Penn State, but that's a different division. So they don't have to do the same thing that Virginia Tech has, or that North Carolina would have to do on Virginia Tech. They don't have to jump Penn State because they're in the other division. They just have to basically win the rest of their own division games. And the only team that's any good in that division is Iowa. And Iowa comes to Madison later on in the season. And, so Wisconsin's going to be favored in that game. And listen, Wisconsin was the better team by and large against Penn State, but the quarterback was terrible. And listen, maybe he's terrible in every game going forward here. We're going to get a good look at them against Notre Dame this weekend. And so maybe you wait on this because again, whatever happens against Notre Dame doesn't have any bearing on what happens in the Big Ten. It's really just more like a scouting. It's like scouting trip for us. But Wisconsin's 12-1 to win the Big Ten. And so whether or not that's a sort of maybe not that great as they always are Ohio State team, or maybe that's against Penn State, who they again just played to, it was basically a tie game for much of that game. Like that game could have gone either way. In either case, all you really need out of Wisconsin is a home win against Iowa to have a 12-1 ticket for the Big Ten championship. They're not going to be 12-1 against either of those teams. So you're going to have value. And if you get a little bit lucky here, maybe Wisconsin ends up as the favorite, or it's a 3-point, pick-a-me type of a game. And you're sitting there with 12-1. So I think there's a ton of value right now in betting Wisconsin to win the Big Ten, because again, people are off the scent a little bit because of how well Iowa has started this season and because of the loss that Wisconsin already has, but it's not that detrimental to their success.
Okay. Let's try to keep some success going in terms of pick wise, because we're going to look ahead to some midweek football action, and we'll stick with the NCAA as we have Marshall at Appalachian State, who are 7-point home favorites.
Yeah.
Which side are you on here? Because it's an interesting team this season, Appalachian State.
Yeah, I mean, they've been really interesting to me because I've been trying to fade them, and that hasn't necessarily worked out. Because, I look at it and listen, I'm still not sold on Chase Bryce. I said it, right? You can't do it. You cannot talk me into Chase Bryce. Okay. So here's the situation here. This is actually a really good game. Unlike last week's game that was just dreadful in about 5 different ways. Marshall and App State here, Marshall lost to ECU last week. They took a really big early lead, 2 touchdowns or so. And then they just, our guy Holton Ahlers, just got it done, right? Just pulls it off, total shootout type of a game. And so, you look at that result, and now they have to go to App State. And again, people think App State's really good. And again, I might be the last person out there, right? I might just be in the desert, just no money left, and just going App State and Chase Bryce isn't very good. And I just might be that dude. And that's fine. But that loss to ECU last week, I think has created some value where now you're getting a full 7 points on a Marshall team who frankly has a better quarterback than App State does. And I like that, right? And I'm I don't think that it's you're going into the dungeon that is Appalachian State, stadium. I don't even really know what it's called. Don't beat me up about that. But you're getting full 7 points on a team that Marshall, I think might be better than App State. And just because App State hung in, right? The last we saw of App State, they hung around with Miami. And we talked about this last week. And speaking of winners, let's hype ourselves up here a little bit here, right? Michigan State against Miami last week. We were on that. We were what is this Miami team, right? Why are we obsessed with this Miami team to the degree that they're 6.5 point favorites against Michigan State? They are just not that good. And we're bummed out about the DRF King situation where he's, he seems to not be fully back from the ACL. But all of that is to say, I'm not congratulating App State for hanging in there with Miami because I don't think Miami's very good.
Yeah.
And so if you're congratulating them for hanging in there with Miami, then there's going to be some value there, right? So like whether it's Marshall losing, which again has no bearing on this game, or App State hanging in with a team that we don't think is any good, like there's just kind of a double value creation thing there. And we're in a full 7 points. And I am absolutely all about that.
Love it. What about when we go to the NFL and Thursday night football action? We've got the Carolina Panthers, who are 7.5-point favorites in Houston. And I touched on it earlier on at the start of the pod, and Tyrod Taylor is out this week.
Yeah.
How does that affect things? Because 7.5 points is a lot. It's a short week, but who is even the starting QB going to be for the Houston Texans?
Right. Your boy Davis Mills, right? Stanford alum. He's the guy who, you know, if you're following our content in the springtime, you know, the draft comes around, everybody's betting the NFL draft. And one of the favorite bets that people make are how many quarterbacks are going to go in the first round, right? And everybody knew the 5 quarterbacks that were going to go in the first round. And then like at the week before the draft kind of comes up and people go like, you know, there's a 6th quarterback that might go in the first round. And people are like, oh, really? Like, should I be betting this? There's plus price on over 5.5. And that 6th quarterback, if you'll recall, was Davis Mills. Now, he didn't end up going in the first round, right? But there was just enough buzz that made people sort of think that he might. So he ends up falling, you know, into what I think 2nd or 3rd round to Houston. Might have been early in the 3rd round. None of that's even relevant. But the point is like he's good enough potentially here to be in that same conversation adjacent, right? Like if we're having a tight conversation at a party and there's somebody who's like grabbing some chips and dip and they like overhear what we're talking about and like maybe they kick in like a salient point and I'm like, I don't even know who you are, sir, but like that's a decent point. That's Davis Mills. He's chips and dip, right? He's over there grabbing some chips and dip. Hopefully he's not double dipping, but maybe he double dips against Carolina. And so like, you know, I wrote about this early in the week, but like I was really bummed out when Tyrod went out, right? Because like Houston started to have vibes of like frisky team that like we should be grabbing double-digit points with each week. Or maybe as a home underdog, they might have a little bit of gumption here. Now he's out, and now we have to trust Davis Mills to get the team into the offense and maybe extend a drive with his legs. It's not really what Davis Mills does, right? That's a Tyrod thing. That's not a Davis Mills type of thing. So a lot of uncertainty here. The line is 7.5. So there's not much being given here. That this is the line that if you literally took Houston's rating and you knocked them down to where we would have them at the start of the season, right? So at the start of the season, it was, all right, here's Houston's range. How bad could it be? Well, let's start there because we think that they're going to be really bad. And over the last 2 weeks, we would have moved them up. But with Davis Mills, we have to kick them almost right back down to kind of the bottom end of their range. And so that's where this line is, right? That this line is built on them being as bad a version of themselves as we could possibly imagine. Now, maybe they're even worse than that. But the point is like back in Carolina here, you're saying that Houston is just going to be terrible. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I would lean to Houston plus 7.5. But what I think I'd rather do here is I might start the tease train a little early this week. Let's tease Carolina down 6 points from 7.5 down to 1.5, right? You're capturing 7, 6, 3, 4, if that's even still a key number anymore in the NFL, which I certainly, sort of question. But like you're capturing a lot of key numbers. You can tie those into a couple of things over the weekend. It's not the sexiest thing that we've ever done in our lives when it comes to betting because you're not cashing a ticket right away if it works out. So I don't think Houston wins this game outright. But 7.5 is a lot to lay. Like people are liking Carolina a ton, but they've been the beneficiaries of, first of all, the Jets and a pretty mangled Saints group this past weekend. So now they go on the road, right? We always talk about going from home to road, especially after 2 in a row. We talked about it in the reverse with the Vikings. This isn't a spot to just start laying points with Carolina. That's a hard pass for me there, but maybe teasing it down and just getting them out of there with a win might be the play.
It's very tough for me as I look at it. And I always try to make the picks just based off of what the actual point spread is, right? In my chase to pick every game and be over 500 and all that. But as I look at the number at 7.5, you're right. Yeah. It's a lot of points to lay. So I feel like if the number stays there, I have a very tough time in just taking Davis Mills. I have a tough time doing that, but I do have a feeling that as the week progresses and as we get to Thursday and all the like Joe Schmoes like myself start trickling in, maybe we can get that number a little higher. Maybe it'll get up to like 8.5 or something like that, where I'd feel a little more comfortable or in thinking I could take Davis Mills. But as of now, I think I'd gotta lean Panthers, and I don't like it. I really don't.
Yeah,
I really don't. But I see what you're saying. I get it.
Pool play, all of that sort of thing, right? It's, and especially because a lot of people are in point spread pools, and it's like it isn't just about winning and losing, right? It's also stealing a couple of games on people, right? Totally. And if, like you said, Joe Schmo is coming in and they're just fine laying the points with Carolina, like to me, this is never Carolina. This is really just are you capable of stomaching a Houston? But I think you're right? Like Thursday, 5 o'clock rolls around, people getting home from work. They're like, what are we getting down on? Maybe the teaser thing becomes really popular because that's the other element. Because I sit here and I say 7.5, let's get this down to 1.5.
Yeah.
What if the books just are inundated with that teaser and they want to move to 9.5 because then a 6-point teaser gets knocked down to 3.5. Right. Well, so now you're looking at 9.5. Maybe there's some cheap 10s out there. And now you're buying, you're getting yourself some extra leeway here with Houston. And so, if we're getting deep into the weeds, which, sometimes you and I like to do, that's how I would play it. Right. I would wait to see if just from teaser protection that this line goes up to 9.5, maybe get a cheap 10, minus 115, a minus 120, something like that to just, make sure that nothing crazy necessarily happens. But I think right now, Carolina is in the market. They are right at the top of where people think. And could they bust through that sort of glass ceiling, if you will, or, teal ceiling? They absolutely could, in the same way that could Houston be even worse. But right now the market has Carolina at the top of what they're doing and Houston at the bottom of what they're doing. And that's just a buy signal. And the more I'm talking about it, the more I'm likely to just bet Houston here at some point. But again, we're going to take a wait and see approach because I think you can do better than 7.5 at some point this week.
And again, we talk about all the lines and where you can find the lines and information on key injury status. Got to go to drf.com/sports for all the details and insights, because that site has you covered with all the data and information on all games, not just the NFL. Remember, they got you covered in the NBA and MLB and all that as well. So head to the site for sure for all that information. But I would like to thank you, Mr. Matt Russell, for joining us here on the DRF Sports Podcast, giving us all the information and education that I love to hear on a week-to-week basis. But where can the people find you if they want to get more of your insight on social media?
Yeah, it's insight, it's celebration, it's commiseration, and it's just bashing the NFL because, what are we doing with these reviews, guys? What are we doing with these taunting calls? What do we can we just have the referees stay out of the game? And I'm not like a let them play guy, because if a guy grabs a guy and hauls him down, pass interference, we got to throw a flag here at some point. But the Julio Jones thing, what are we doing reversing that? Yeah. Anyway, for that type of just bitterness and even occasional salient points and maybe some insight and some picks along the way, find me at mrussauthentic on Twitter. All my stuff that I write for The Score is over there, and just anything else that sort of comes to mind. I promise not to blow up your feed. If I say something, I'd like to think that it's at least somewhat helpful. Whether that's emotional or educational, that's up for you to decide. Sometimes it's very much an emotional situation. But yeah, find me over there at mrussauthentic on Twitter.
Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate you joining us. Thanks to Matt for coming on the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander or on Twitter at Shell Alexander. But for more exclusive data, analytics, preview videos, and expert picks on all the major sports, drf.com/sports has you covered. Don't forget to subscribe to the DRF Sports YouTube page. And for all other DRF content, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter. That's all I got for now, but don't forget to like, rate, and follow the pod, because we're here twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, the DRF Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.